What happened when the judge saw the text my ex-husband sent about our disabled son? I was helping my 9-year-old son Alfie practice with his communication device for tomorrow's custody hearing. Due to cerebral palsy, Alfie's speech is limited and he lives in a wheelchair, but he'd been working for weeks with his tablet to tell the judge he wanted to live with me. He'd just typed out, "I love mommy," and the device spoke it aloud when my phone buzzed. It was my ex-husband Graham, who was fighting for full custody, claiming I was an unfit mother. Stop coaching that broken kid to lie. He's better off in a care facility than with either of us, but at least I won't parade him around for sympathy like you do. Tomorrow when I get custody, he's going straight to St. Mary's Institution. It's already arranged. I stared at my phone in horror. Before I could move, Alfie had wheeled closer. He pointed at my phone, then signed, "Tomorrow?" One of the few signs he could manage. I tried to pull it away, but he'd already leaned over to look at the text. His face crumpled. He typed frantically on his device. "Broken?" Tears rolled down his face. He struggled to sign "Dad." "No. Want me?" He was sobbing now, his body shaking with effort as he typed, "Why Dad hate me?" I dropped to my knees beside his wheelchair, pulling him close. "You are not going to any institution. We're going to that hearing, and the judge will know exactly who your father is." Alfie typed. Dad said, "Dad is wrong. Tomorrow we are going to win." I immediately called my lawyer. Graham just texted that he's putting Alfie in an institution tomorrow. I put her on speaker. "He what?" "Forward that immediately." "Alfie, sweetheart, you're not going anywhere. This changes everything." Alfie was typing slowly through his tears. "Am I broken?" "No, baby. Dad's the one who's broken, not you." My phone rang. Graham's mother, Helen. "I just heard what Graham's planning. I'm testifying for you tomorrow. My grandson is not going to an institution." Alfie's eyes widened. He typed, "Grandma, help us?" "Always, sweetheart." Graham texted again. "Better pack his things tonight. St. Mary's expects him by 3 p.m. tomorrow." Alfie saw it and frantically typed, "No, no, 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 no." His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hit the right letters. My sister arrived with her phone. "Alfie, want to show me what you prepared for tomorrow?" Alfie had been working on a longer message for weeks. He pulled it up on his tablet. The text he'd painstakingly typed. "I want to stay with mommy. She helps me. She understands when I can't talk. Dad gets mad when I move wrong. Please don't send me away." Graham texted, "The facility has a wheelchair-accessible room ready. $4,000 a month, but worth it to be free." Then, "He can't even talk properly. He needs professional care." Then, "You can visit monthly." My neighbor, who was a social worker, came over. "I heard from Helen. I'm writing an emergency report about Alfie thriving in your care." She watched Alfie using his device, doing his exercises. Any facility would destroy his progress. His communication has improved so much here. Graham's brother Tom called. "I found out Graham's been planning this for months. He's been telling people Alfie is too damaged to live normally. I'm testifying tomorrow." I put him on speaker. "Alfie, you hearing this, buddy?" Alfie typed a single word. "Uncle." That evening we prepared everything. Alfie's pre-typed statement. His therapy progress videos showing him learning new signs. The texts. "Mom," Alfie typed slowly. "What if Judge not say yes to me?" I told him he was too handsome to say no to. And his face lit up with that goofy smile that made me cry so much over the years. The next morning, Alfie wore his best clothes. He typed, "Do I look like crazy kid?" "You look like a brave boy who's about to win," I said. We arrived at the courthouse. Graham was there with his lawyer, smirking, but his face changed when he saw Helen walk in with us. "Mom, what are you doing here?" "What's right?" she said coldly. Alfie typed quickly and his device spoke. "Hi, Grandma." In the courtroom, Graham's lawyer started strong, talking about special needs requiring professional care. Then my lawyer stood. "Your Honor, I have texts from Mr. Graham sent yesterday." She read them aloud. The judge's face darkened with each word. "Broken kid?" he repeated. "Institution already arranged?" Graham went pale. "That's out of context." But then Helen stood up. "Your Honor, I have recordings." She played one. Graham's voice filled the courtroom. "I never wanted a R-worded kid. He ruins everything. Can't even speak like a human." Alfie raised his hand and pointed to his tablet. The judge nodded. "Go ahead, young man." Alfie hit play on his prepared message. The computerized voice spoke clearly. "My dad thinks I am broken, but I am not broken. I am Alfie. I love my mom. Please let me stay with her." The judge looked at Graham with disgust. "Mr. Graham, in my 30 years..." But then Graham exploded, standing up and pointing at Alfie. "That's not him talking. That's a machine. He's too brain damaged to think. He belongs in a home with other defects." The courtroom gasped. Alfie started typing frantically as Graham approached. The bailiff moved fast, stepping right between Graham and us while Graham kept coming forward with his fists clenched. I grabbed Alfie's wheelchair handles and pulled him back hard, nearly running into the bench behind us. The judge was banging his gavel over and over, the sound echoing through the courtroom like gunshots. Alfie's whole body was shaking and his fingers kept slipping off his tablet screen, but he wouldn't stop trying to type. Graham took another step and the bailiff put both hands up to block him. The judge stood up from his chair and his face was bright red. "Mr. Graham, you will sit down immediately or be removed from this courtroom." Graham stopped moving but stayed standing there, breathing hard through his nose. His lawyer jumped up and grabbed Graham's arm, pulling him back toward their table. Nobody in the courtroom made a sound except for Alfie's ragged breathing next to me. Graham finally let his lawyer drag him to his seat, but his eyes stayed locked on us. The judge slammed his gavel one more time. 15-minute recess. Both lawyers in my chambers now. People started moving and talking all at once. I wheeled Alfie out to the hallway as fast as I could, my hands trembling on the handles. Helen and Tom were already waiting by the door, and Helen dropped to her knees next to Alfie's chair. Alfie was typing on his device and the mechanical voice said, "Dad's scary," before he started crying into my shoulder. I held him tight while Tom stood guard by the door, watching for Graham. My lawyer came back from chambers 10 minutes later with this look on her face like she'd won something big. She pulled me to the side while Helen showed Alfie pictures on her phone to distract him. "The judge is furious and wants to issue an immediate protective order," she said quietly. "We're going to present all the evidence now. Everything we have." I nodded and looked back at Alfie, who was still shaking in his chair. The bailiff called us back into the courtroom and we filed in slowly. Graham was already sitting at his table, staring straight ahead with his jaw clenched tight. The judge came in and his whole face looked different, cold and professional like he was made of stone. He looked straight at Graham. "Mr. Graham, one more outburst and you'll be held in contempt." Graham didn't move or speak. His lawyer was whispering in his ear, but Graham just sat there rigid in his chair. The judge nodded to my lawyer to continue. She stood up with a stack of papers and started reading Graham's texts out loud, her voice clear and steady. "Stop coaching that broken kid to lie," she read. "Better off in a care facility." People in the gallery started shaking their heads. $4,000 a month, but worth it to be free," she continued, and I heard someone gasp behind us. Alfie had his tablet in his lap and was typing something, his face focused despite the tears still on his cheeks. My lawyer kept reading each horrible text while the court reporter typed everything into the record. Helen stood up when called to testify, walking to the witness stand with her hands clasped tight together. Her voice shook, but she spoke clearly about Graham's planning. "He called St. Mary's Institution back in January," she said. "I found the phone records." She explained how Graham had been researching facilities for months without telling anyone. He never intended to actually parent his son, he just wanted control. The judge asked for the audio recording and Helen pulled out her phone with trembling fingers. Graham's voice filled the courtroom, using that awful word about Alfie, saying he never wanted him. Several people in the gallery gasped, and Graham's lawyer put his head down on the table for a second. Alfie flinched hard when he heard his dad's voice, but his fingers kept moving on his tablet. The recording kept playing, Graham's voice getting angrier, talking about how Alfie ruined everything and couldn't even speak like a human. My neighbor came up next to testify, the social worker who'd been helping us. She talked about watching Alfie practice with his device every day, doing his physical therapy exercises. "Institutionalization would destroy everything he's worked for," she said firmly. She explained how Alfie had learned 12 new signs in the past 6 months and could type full sentences now. He's thriving in his current environment with his mother's support, and removing him would cause severe regression. She showed photos of Alfie's progress charts and therapy notes. Tom took the stand last, holding a folder of printed emails. "I found these in Graham's sent folder when he asked me to fix his computer," he said. He read parts out loud, Graham asking different facilities about their rates and visiting policies. "He was shopping around for the cheapest place that would take a child with cerebral palsy," Tom said, his voice thick with disgust. One email from February asked if the facility would handle all medical decisions so parents wouldn't have to be involved. Graham's face turned purple, but he kept his mouth shut, his lawyer's hand on his arm. Tom kept reading more emails where Graham complained about the burden and asked about tax deductions for institutionalized dependents. The judge's face got darker with each email Tom read, and finally he held up his hand to stop him. He turned his chair toward Alfie, who was still typing away on his tablet with this look of total focus on his face. The judge asked if Alfie wanted to share what he'd been working on, and Alfie's head snapped up, his eyes wide. He looked at me and I nodded. Then he looked back at his tablet, and his finger hovered over the speak button for a second before pressing it. The computer voice came out clear and steady through the courtroom speakers. "I am not broken. I am smart. I want my mommy. Dad makes me sad." The whole courtroom went quiet, and I saw the judge's face change, his mouth getting softer as he watched Alfie sit up straighter in his wheelchair. The judge turned back to face the whole courtroom and started talking in this really official voice about reviewing all the evidence presented. He went through each piece, the texts, the recordings, the testimony from family members, the social worker's report. Graham kept trying to interrupt, but his lawyer kept grabbing his arm and whispering at him to stay quiet. The judge said he was issuing an immediate temporary order granting me full physical custody with supervised visitation only for Graham. He also said he was appointing a guardian ad litem to represent Alfie's interests and ordering a full custody evaluation. Graham shot up from his chair, but the bailiff moved closer and he sat back down. The judge kept going, scheduling a status conference in 6 weeks, and warning Graham that any violation of the protective order would result in immediate arrest. He told the bailiff to escort Graham out through the separate exit for safety, and Graham's face turned purple, but he didn't say anything. As they led him toward the door, Alfie typed quickly and showed me his screen. "Safe now?" I told him yes, we were safe, and Helen came over and wrapped both of us in this huge hug. We stayed in the courtroom for a few more minutes while my lawyer explained what would happen next. Then we headed out to the parking lot where Tom was waiting by our car. The ride home was quiet, except for Alfie's tablet making little clicking sounds as he typed different things and deleted them without hitting the speak button. Back at the house that evening, everything felt different, like the walls were too close and the air was too thick. Alfie started breathing really fast while we were eating dinner, and his hands started shaking. I got him to his quiet corner with his weighted blanket, but 20 minutes later it happened again. He kept typing the same thing over and over on his device. "Dad hate me?" Each time I told him Dad's problems weren't his fault, but he'd just type it again. We did his calming exercises, the ones his occupational therapist taught us, counting to 10 while squeezing his stress ball, but he had 3 more attacks before bedtime. I wrote down the time and what triggered each one in the notebook I kept for medical stuff, knowing the court would probably want to see it. He finally fell asleep around 11, his tablet still clutched in his hands with those 3 words on the screen. The next morning, my phone rang at 8:30, and it was someone from the court coordinator's office. She gave me the name and contact information for Siobhan Merritt, the guardian ad litem they assigned to Alfie's case. She said Siobhan wanted to meet with us later in the week to start her assessment, and would call me directly to set it up. Alfie wheeled into the kitchen while I was still on the phone and started making his breakfast, which was just cereal, but he liked doing it himself. When I hung up, he typed a question on his device. Kid lawyer? It was the first time I'd smiled since yesterday, and I told him yes. Kind of like a kid lawyer who makes sure kids are safe and happy. After breakfast, I called Kira Novak, Alfie's speech therapist, and asked if she could write up detailed documentation about his AAC progress over the past year. She said absolutely, and started listing all the improvements she'd seen, how he went from single words to full sentences, how he learned to use the prediction features, how his vocabulary expanded. She said she'd testify in court if needed about how damaging it would be to put him in an institution, how he'd lose all his communication skills. While I made phone calls, Alfie sat at the table doing his hand exercises with the therapy putty, making different shapes and squeezing it different ways. Around noon, the supervised visitation system called, and I could hear Graham's voice in the background before the supervisor even explained why they were calling. Graham wanted to talk to Alfie, but as soon as he got on the line, he started yelling about the unfair ruling and how I'd poisoned everyone against him. I hung up within 30 seconds, which the protective order said I could do if he became hostile. Alfie heard his dad's angry voice from the living room and wheeled in fast, his face all worried. I told him Dad called, but I hung up because he wasn't being nice, and Alfie nodded and went back to his puzzle. 3 days later, Siobhan Merritt came to our house in the evening to watch our regular routine. Alfie hid behind me at first when she came in, but she sat on the floor, not towering over him in his wheelchair, and asked if he wanted to show her his tablet. He started with just pointing at different app icons, but then he opened his communication program and showed her how he could type whole sentences and how the prediction helped him go faster. She watched me help him with his night routine, the stretches, the medications, getting him ready for bed, taking notes in this little notebook. The next day, Helen came over to meet with Siobhan separately, while Alfie and I worked on a dinosaur puzzle in the living room. I could hear Helen's voice from the kitchen, not the words, but the tone, sad and frustrated. Later, Helen told me she'd explained how Graham never wanted to learn Alfie's exercises or how to use the communication device, how he just saw Alfie as this burden that ruined his life. While they talked, Alfie and I finished the puzzle and he typed, "Grandma sad?" on his device, and I said Grandma was just worried about making sure he was safe. Over the next few days, I collected letters from Alfie's pediatrician and from Kira about what would happen if Alfie went to an institution. They both wrote about how he needed consistent care from someone who understood his communication style, how he'd regress without that stability. The pediatrician wrote 3 pages about the medical impacts, the likelihood of depression, the loss of skills. Kira's letter talked about kids she'd seen who came out of institutions basically starting over from scratch with communication. While I gathered documents, Alfie practiced his newest signs with Kira during therapy, showing her please and thank you and more, with his hands that didn't always cooperate but tried so hard. 2 days later, Luis Serrano called to schedule his evaluation interviews. His voice was all business on the phone as he explained he'd need to meet with both Graham and me separately over the next 2 weeks. My stomach dropped, but I kept washing dishes while Alfie played with his tablet in the living room. Luis said he'd visit Graham's apartment first, then mine, then interview us each about our parenting history. I agreed to his schedule and hung up, my hands shaking as I dried the last plate. Alfie wheeled over and pointed at my face, then typed on his device. "Mommy okay?" came the robotic voice, and I realized I'd been holding my breath. I told him yes and suggested we do his stretches early today. While I helped him with his leg exercises, my phone buzzed with a text from my lawyer. She said Luis was known for being thorough and fair, which should work in our favor. 3 days passed before Luis visited Graham's place. I only found out about it later when Luis mentioned it during my interview. He'd spent 2 hours at Graham's apartment taking notes and photos. Graham had shown him around, talking about his work schedule and income. But when Luis asked about accessibility equipment for Alfie, Graham had nothing to show. No grab bars in the bathroom, no special seating, no therapy equipment. Graham told him the institution would handle all that stuff anyway. Luis wrote everything down in his notebook without comment. That same evening, Graham posted on Facebook about fathers being treated unfairly by the courts. He didn't use our names but complained about alienation and how mothers always win custody battles. My sister saw it first and sent me screenshots before I could see it myself. My lawyer called within an hour, telling me to stay completely off social media. She said to document everything but not engage at all. I blocked Graham on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter that night. The supervised visitation center called the next morning to schedule Graham's first visit with Alfie. They had an opening for the following Tuesday at 3 p.m. Alfie heard me talking and wheeled over fast, his eyes wide with worry. He typed quickly on his tablet. "Have to see Dad?" The device asked, and I knelt down beside his chair. I explained that yes, he'd see Dad, but there would be other adults there the whole time. The supervisor would make sure nothing bad happened. Alfie typed, "Promise?" And I promised, though my own heart was racing. That night, Alfie woke up screaming at 2 a.m. I ran to his room and found him tangled in his sheets, his tablet on the floor where it had fallen. He was trying to reach it, crying and making the few sounds he could manage. I helped him sit up and handed him the device. He typed the same 2 words over and over. No institution, no institution, no institution. I held him while he cried, then helped him type out what he'd dreamed about. White walls, strangers touching him, no tablet, no way to talk. I wrote everything down in the log I'd started keeping for Luis and Siobhan. The next 3 nights were the same. Alfie would wake up terrified, typing about being sent away. I started sleeping on his floor just to be closer when the nightmares came. We tried a new bedtime routine with his favorite stuffed dinosaur, and a nightlight that projected stars on the ceiling. It helped a little, but not much. Luis came to interview me on a Thursday afternoon. He sat at my kitchen table with his notebook and recorder, asking about everything. How long had Graham and I been married? When did we separate? What was Graham's relationship with Alfie like before the divorce? I kept my answers simple and factual. Graham never wanted to learn Alfie's exercises. Graham got frustrated when Alfie couldn't speak clearly. Graham called him names when he thought I wasn't listening. Luis asked about our daily routine and I walked him through everything. Morning medications, breakfast with the special spoon that helped Alfie grip better, physical therapy exercises, communication practice with the tablet. Alfie was in his room playing, but Luis asked if he could meet him. Alfie wheeled out slowly, hiding behind his tablet at first. But when Luis asked about the dinosaur game on his screen, Alfie perked up. He showed Luis how he could type full sentences and how the prediction feature helped him go faster. Luis watched for 20 minutes, taking notes the whole time. Tuesday came too fast. Alfie was shaking as I pushed his wheelchair into the visitation center. The supervisor, a woman with gray hair and kind eyes, met us in the lobby. She explained the rules to both of us while we waited for Graham. He arrived 5 minutes late, complaining about parking. The supervisor led us all to a playroom with cameras in the corners. Graham sat in a chair across from Alfie and immediately started talking fast. So, buddy, ready to come live with Daddy? He asked, not waiting for Alfie to type a response. Alfie started typing, but Graham kept talking over the device's voice. The supervisor had to interrupt twice, reminding Graham to let Alfie finish his thoughts. Graham rolled his eyes but stayed quiet for a few seconds. Alfie managed to type, I like Mom House, before Graham started up again about all the fun things they'd do together. When Alfie tried to show Graham a new app on his tablet, Graham grabbed it to look closer. Alfie made a distressed sound and reached for it back. Graham held it higher, saying he just wanted to see. The supervisor had to physically hand the tablet back to Alfie. The hour felt like forever, but finally ended. Alfie stayed silent the whole drive home and all through dinner. He only typed single words when I asked direct questions. Tired. No. Bed. I didn't push him to talk more. The visitation report came 3 days later. The supervisor noted Graham's impatience with the AAC device and his tendency to speak for Alfie instead of letting him communicate. She wrote that Graham seemed uncomfortable with Alfie's physical limitations and kept suggesting activities Alfie couldn't do, like playing catch or riding bikes. I felt sad reading it, but not surprised. This was the Graham I knew. Tom called that evening with something important. He'd been going through old messages and found screenshots from last summer. Graham had been researching care facilities since June, comparing prices and asking about their policies. One message asked specifically about minimum visitation requirements, like he was already planning to visit as little as possible. Tom emailed everything to me and I forwarded it straight to my lawyer. I made sure Alfie was in his room with headphones on first. He didn't need to know his dad had been planning this for months. The next day, Kira came for Alfie's regular speech therapy session, but this time she focused on preparing him for his interview with Siobhan. She brought visual cards showing different emotions and practiced asking him questions about where he felt safe. Alfie pointed to the card showing a house, then typed Mom House on his tablet. Kira asked who helps him when he needs something. Alfie typed Mommy immediately, then added Grandma Helen, and Kira helped too. They practiced for an hour, with Alfie getting more confident each time. 2 days later, Siobhan arrived at our house carrying a folder and a small bag of toys she said helped kids feel comfortable during interviews. I set Alfie up in the living room with his tablet fully charged while I went to the kitchen, though she said I could come back if he needed me. Through the doorway, I could see Alfie typing slowly on his device while Siobhan sat on the floor at his eye level, waiting patiently for each response without rushing him. He kept pointing at the screen, then at himself, and I heard his device say, "Want mommy," several times before adding, "Dad mad," when I slow. Siobhan spent almost 2 hours with him, letting him show her his favorite apps and the special phrases he'd programmed, and I noticed she took notes every time his device spoke, but never interrupted him. When she finally called me back in, Alfie was smiling and had typed "nice lady" on his screen, which he showed me proudly before wheeling over for a hug. The next morning, Helen called sounding upset and asked if she could come over to talk about something important. She arrived with red eyes and immediately started apologizing for not seeing Graham's problems sooner, saying she'd been thinking about all the times he'd complained about Alfie being too much work, and she'd just ignored it. Before I could respond, she offered to drive Alfie to his therapy appointments twice a week, so I could handle all the legal paperwork without rushing. Alfie heard her voice from his room and came wheeling out, typing, "Grandma sad?" on his device, which made Helen cry harder. She promised him special ice cream stops after every therapy session if I said yes, and seeing Alfie's face light up at the idea made the decision easy. 3 days later, we had to go back to the supervised visitation center for Graham's second visit, and Alfie was less scared this time, but still grabbed my hand tight before we went in. Graham actually sat still when Alfie started typing, though I could see his jaw clenching when it took Alfie a full minute to type out a sentence about his new reading level at the school. The supervisor wrote notes constantly, especially when Graham's foot started tapping impatiently, but he managed to wait for Alfie to finish most of his thoughts before responding. Alfie even relaxed enough to tell Graham about the class hamster through his device, typing out how he got to feed it last week, though Graham just nodded without really seeming interested. After the visit, the supervisor pulled me aside to say Graham was following the rules better, but still showed clear discomfort with Alfie's communication needs. That same week, Luis called asking for 3 years of financial records from both of us, including receipts for Alfie's equipment, therapies, and medical expenses. I spent 2 nights organizing everything, finding receipts for his wheelchair maintenance, tablet upgrades, therapy copays, special seating for the car, and accessibility modifications we'd made to the house. Graham apparently complained to Luis about the cost of everything, not realizing Luis was documenting his attitude about Alfie's necessary expenses. My lawyer later told me Luis found documents showing Graham had researched claiming Alfie as a dependent while institutionalized, calculating the tax benefits he'd receive. The school called an IEP meeting for the following Monday, saying they needed to update Alfie's communication goals and add new safety protocols given the custody situation. The whole team gathered in the conference room while Alfie demonstrated his progress, typing out multi-word phrases and even attempting a short sentence about his favorite subject, science. They added strict pickup protocols to his file, requiring photo ID and the court order documentation for anyone trying to take him from the school. The principal personally assured me that the bus driver and all staff knew the situation, and they created a special code word system for authorized pickups. Alfie practiced the code word on his device over and over until he could type it quickly. About a week later, my lawyer forwarded me an email that Graham had sent to Siobhan, claiming I was coaching all of Alfie's responses, and that he couldn't really communicate independently. Siobhan had already compared videos of Alfie from therapy sessions, school, and home, noting his consistent phrasing patterns and vocabulary choices that matched his developmental level perfectly. She wrote back to Graham that Alfie's communication was clearly authentic and age-appropriate, dismissing his accusation completely. I only found out about this exchange weeks later when reviewing court documents, but it explained why Graham seemed extra frustrated during his next visit. My sister offered to take Alfie to the Science Museum one Saturday, so I could finally attend a therapy session my doctor had been recommending for months. Alfie spent the whole morning programming silly phrases into his tablet to show my sister, typing things like "Aunt is silly" and "more pizza please," which made them both laugh. While they were gone, I sat in the therapist's office and just cried for 20 minutes before we even started talking about strategies for managing the stress. She helped me create a daily schedule that included 5 minutes of deep breathing, while Alfie did his morning exercises, and suggested writing down 3 good moments each day to balance all the legal documentation. Alfie came home with a huge smile, showing me the new dinosaur facts he'd programmed into his device with my sister's help. 2 days later, a mutual friend from Graham's work called saying Graham wanted to discuss settling everything outside court and asked if I'd consider meeting him for coffee. I politely told her I couldn't discuss anything without lawyers present and immediately called my attorney to document the attempted contact. She said this was typical behavior when someone realized they were losing, trying to avoid the official consequences. I made sure Alfie was at the school when I took the call, so he wouldn't overhear anything that might upset him. Meanwhile, Luis was conducting phone interviews with all of Alfie's medical providers, and his pediatrician spent 40 minutes explaining how devastating institutionalization would be for a child like Alfie. She gave specific examples of other patients who'd regressed after being placed in facilities, losing communication skills and developing depression. The doctor emphasized that Alfie's progress depended on consistent, loving care from someone who understood his unique needs, not rotating staff at an institution. Her medical opinion carried serious weight in Luis's evaluation. By the end of that week, Siobhan had compiled all her observations and interviews into a preliminary recommendation that strongly favored keeping Alfie with me. She recommended supervised visitation only for Graham with mandatory parenting classes, specifically designed for parents of special needs children. Her report noted Alfie's clear preference expressed consistently across multiple interviews, Graham's lack of preparation for Alfie's needs, and his concerning financial motivations. Though I wouldn't see the full report until later, I could tell from her thorough approach that she'd documented everything carefully. 2 weeks later, we were back at the supervised visitation center for Graham's 3rd visit with Alfie, and I could see Graham trying harder to follow the rules this time, keeping his voice calm and not making sudden movements that might scare Alfie. He'd brought some kind of tablet game with him and set it up on the table between them while the supervisor took notes in the corner. Alfie wheeled closer to look at the game, but then pointed at his communication device, which was still in his lap, because Graham had put the game tablet right where Alfie usually puts his AAC device to type. Graham didn't seem to understand why Alfie wasn't playing the game, and kept tapping the screen trying to show him how it worked while Alfie kept pointing at his own device, and then at the table where he needed space. The supervisor finally stepped in and suggested Graham move the game tablet to the side so Alfie could position his communication device properly, but Graham looked confused and said he thought they were the same thing since they were both tablets. Alfie started typing to explain, but Graham was already talking over the device's voice saying he knew Alfie liked games, and this one had cars in it. I watched through the observation window as Alfie tried 3 different times to type something, but each time Graham would interrupt by pointing at the game again, until finally Alfie just gave up and watched Graham play the game by himself for the rest of the visit. The supervisor wrote several pages of notes about Graham not understanding the difference between a toy and Alfie's voice. That same afternoon, my lawyer came to my apartment with boxes of evidence folders, and we spread everything across my dining room table while Alfie did his homework in the living room. We organized the threatening texts into one exhibit with each message printed and highlighted, then the audio recordings Helen had given us labeled with dates and transcribed, then all the medical reports from Alfie's doctors about how institutionalization would harm him, and finally the therapy progress videos Kira had helped us compile. Alfie rolled in to see what we were doing and immediately pointed at one of the video thumbnails on my laptop showing him from 6 months ago, struggling with his device compared to now when he could type full sentences. He typed, "I got better," and pointed at another video from last month where he was using 3-word phrases fluently, and I asked if he wanted to help choose which videos showed his progress best. He spent an hour going through clips with us, typing, "Use this one" for a video where he successfully ordered his own food at a restaurant using his device, and this too for one where he was teaching another kid at the school how to use sign language. By the time we finished organizing everything into labeled folders, we had 15 exhibits ready for court, and Alfie typed, "We have lots of proof," before going back to his homework. 3 days later, we were back at the courthouse for the status conference, and I sat in the courtroom while Alfie waited in the hallway with Helen because the judge said he didn't need to be present for this procedural hearing. The judge reviewed the thick reports from both Luis and Siobhan, flipping through pages while both lawyers sat quietly, and I could see Graham across the aisle drumming his fingers on the table. After 20 minutes of reading, the judge looked up and said he was maintaining all protective orders currently in place, and set our final hearing date for 3 weeks out, which made my stomach drop because I wanted this over with, but also terrified of that final day. Graham's lawyer stood up and requested that his client be granted unsupervised visitation in the interim, since he'd been compliant with the supervised visits. But the judge cut him off mid-sentence and said based on both evaluators' reports, that was absolutely not happening, and supervised visitation would continue. When we left the courtroom, Alfie was in the hallway with Helen and he'd been practicing typing, "I want to stay with mommy," over and over on his device, and Helen told me he'd typed it at least 50 times while we were inside. The night before the final hearing arrived faster than I expected, and Alfie couldn't eat dinner because his stomach hurt from nerves, so we just practiced his responses instead, while his mac and cheese got cold on the table. I'd ask him simple questions the judge might ask, and he'd type his answers like, "My name is Alfie, and I am 9 years old, and I live with mommy," and each time he'd look at me to make sure he did it right. He kept typing, "I am brave," between practice questions like he was trying to convince himself, and after the 20th time he typed it, I believed he was starting to believe it too. We made his favorite chocolate chip pancakes for dinner instead since he couldn't stomach the mac and cheese, and I promised him that tomorrow would be the very last scary court day, and after this we'd be done with courtrooms forever. He typed, "Promise?" And I said yes, even though I knew there might be appeals or modifications later, but he didn't need to know that tonight. The next morning, the final hearing began, and we sat at our table while Graham's lawyer stood up first, arguing that Alfie's complex needs exceeded a single parent's capacity to provide adequate care and required the resources of a professional facility. The judge's face stayed completely neutral while the lawyer talked, but I noticed him flipping through our evidence packets while Graham's lawyer droned on about statistics and state resources and therapeutic ratios. Alfie sat right beside me with his tablet ready on the table in front of him, wearing the special blue shirt with dinosaurs that Grandma Helen had bought him just for today because she said he needed to feel confident. My lawyer stood up next and methodically presented our evidence starting with the therapy videos, and the judge leaned forward watching the screen as the video showed Alfie from 8 months ago, barely able to use his device compared to last week when he was typing complex sentences and even making jokes. The judge's eyes moved to Alfie when in the video Alfie successfully communicated with a store clerk to buy his own snack, and I saw something shift in his expression like he was really seeing Alfie as a person, not just a case number. Alfie noticed himself on the screen and typed, "That's me," which made several people in the gallery smile, and even the court reporter looked up from her machine to watch. Kira took the stand next as our expert witness and explained in clear terms how AAC devices work and how critical consistent support is for children learning to use them as their primary communication method. She told the court that institutionalization almost always causes regression in communication skills because staff rotate too frequently and don't have time to learn each child's specific communication patterns and needs. She used specific examples from her 20 years of experience, including one child who lost all his communication skills after 6 months in a facility and never recovered them even after returning home. Siobhan stood up to read her full recommendation, and her voice was steady and professional as she detailed her interviews with Alfie and how consistently he expressed wanting to stay with me across multiple sessions using different communication methods. She recommended sole physical custody to me with supervised visitation continuing for Graham and mandatory parenting classes specifically designed for parents of special needs, children plus individual therapy to address his ableist attitudes. Alfie squeezed my hand so tight when she said sole physical custody that I could feel his pulse racing through his palm. Luis presented his evaluation next, covering Graham's complete lack of preparation for Alfie's physical needs, including no wheelchair accessibility in his apartment and no understanding of Alfie's medical equipment or therapy schedule. He also presented evidence of Graham's financial motivations, including documents showing Graham had researched tax benefits of claiming a disabled dependent while having them institutionalized and emails where he calculated how much money he'd save not paying for Alfie's therapies. He mentioned Graham had shown some improvement during supervised visits, but emphasized it wasn't nearly enough to ensure Alfie's safety or well-being. Finally, Graham took the stand and tried to explain away his texts and recordings, saying he was just frustrated and didn't really mean he wanted Alfie in an institution, even though he'd literally toured 3 facilities and put down a deposit at one. Under cross-examination, my lawyer got him to admit he'd never learned to use Alfie's communication device properly, despite having 9 years to do so. And yes, he did think an institution would be more convenient than actually parenting. His testimony was devastating to his own case, and even his lawyer looked defeated as Graham stepped down from the stand. The judge cleared his throat and shuffled his papers while the courtroom stayed completely silent. He looked straight at me, then at Alfie, then spent a long time staring at Graham, who was slumped in his chair. His gavel came down once. I am granting sole physical custody to the mother with joint legal custody under strict conditions. My whole body went weak, and I grabbed the table to stay upright while Alfie's fingers flew across his tablet until the device said, "We won?" And I nodded through tears that wouldn't stop coming. The judge kept talking about Graham needing parenting classes for special needs children and individual therapy before any unsupervised contact would even be considered. He said all communication had to go through some court app, and the protective order would stay in place. Graham's face turned red, but his lawyer put a hand on his arm to keep him seated. The judge explained that all custody exchanges would happen at the supervised visitation center downtown, and Graham couldn't make any medical or educational decisions without my written consent. Alfie was listening so carefully and typed something else, and his device asked, "No institution ever?" The judge actually looked right at him and said, "Never, young man," which made Alfie smile bigger than I'd seen in months. Helen reached over and squeezed my shoulder while Tom nodded from his seat behind us. The bailiff handed us paperwork while Graham stormed out with his lawyer chasing after him. That afternoon back home, Kira came over with visual cards she'd made showing stick figures and simple words to help explain everything. Alfie pointed at the card showing a house with a mom figure and typed, "I stay here?" And I showed him the yes card over and over. He asked through his device if Grandma Helen and Uncle Tom could still visit, and I explained they'd actually be around even more now that everything was settled. He spent 20 minutes programming something new into his tablet, and finally played it for us, and the mechanical voice said, "I am safe with Mommy," which he played 5 more times while grinning. 3 days passed before the court app buzzed with Graham's first message asking about Alfie's therapy schedule so visits wouldn't conflict. I typed back just the times and locations without any extra words, keeping it simple like my lawyer said. Alfie was in the other room doing his exercises and didn't need to know about these messages yet. The next morning, I drove to Alfie's school with the custody papers and sat in the principal's office while they updated his file. They created a special pickup code word that only approved people would know and took photos of everyone allowed to get him, including Helen and Tom. The secretary promised to brief the bus driver personally and showed me where they'd keep the court order in Alfie's emergency folder. Alfie felt so important when the principal shook his hand and told him they were all working together to keep him safe. 2 weeks later, we went to the supervised visitation center for Graham's first visit since the ruling. The building smelled like cleaning products and had bright murals on the walls that Alfie pointed at while we waited. Graham arrived 5 minutes late and sat across from Alfie at the small table, while the supervisor positioned herself where she could see everything. Graham waited while Alfie typed responses instead of trying to rush him like before. He even asked Alfie to teach him a sign, and Alfie slowly showed him the motion for thank you, which Graham practiced 3 times before getting it right. The supervisor wrote notes the whole time and smiled when Alfie relaxed enough to show Graham a drawing from the school on his tablet. That evening after his bath, Alfie worked on his tablet for almost an hour creating something new. He kept playing with the voice settings until he got it just right, then saved it to his home screen. The device spoke clearly saying, "I am Alfie. I am smart. I am loved." He played it again and again, each time breaking into that huge smile that crinkled his whole face. I grabbed my phone and recorded him playing his new message and watching his own reaction in the tablet's black screen between plays. He made me play the video back 4 times before bed. A week later, our house had found its rhythm with therapy on Tuesdays and Thursdays, supervised visits every other Saturday, and Graham's messages through the app staying short and factual. The stack of legal papers sat in a folder on the kitchen counter, but we didn't need to look at them anymore. Alfie slept through the whole night without waking up scared, something that hadn't happened since this whole mess started. His breakfast stayed down, and he even laughed at cartoons before school. The bus driver waved extra long when picking him up, and Alfie waved back with both hands. I stood at the window watching the bus disappear around the corner and realized my shoulders weren't tight anymore. We weren't just getting through each day now. We were actually living them. Well, folks, that was definitely a journey. Appreciate you being here and wondering through it all with me. Until we meet again, take care. Like the video, it helps more than you think.